So the first algorithm I'll start talking about is k-means clustering, and then this is a pretty commonly seen partitional clustering method. So basically for a given number of clusters k, we want to assign objects to clusters such that we can minimize the total squared Euclidean distance between intra-cluster objects. So basically making sure that within a cluster, all of those samples and data points are very packed together. And the algorithm I'm specifically going to talk about today is the most common one, which is naive k-means, but there are a lot of variations that you can also look into on your own time if you're interested. So k-means is pretty well, scales pretty well, and it's also relatively simple to implement, which is why it's popular. But one question that you might have right now is how do we actually figure out what the k should be? And so the correct K is kind of an ambiguous concept because part of it does depend on your end goal. Do you want really granular clusters? Do you want a lot of small clusters? You're looking at something very specific, or do you want to kind of see very broad divisions across your data? And for that reason, often you can select K if you have a lot of prior knowledge of the data set, or maybe like we mentioned earlier, if we have some kind of visualization of the data set where we can start guessing what K is. But there's also more systematic and programmatic methods for determining K. There's the elbow method, which looks at how much explained variance there is for each value, each potential value of K. There's a variation of k-means clustering called x-means clustering, where basically you keep iterating through different numbers of clusters to identify the best split based on some quality metric or some information criterion. And then the one that I'm going to be introducing today is the silhouette method, where essentially you want to minimize the intra-cluster distance and maximize the intercluster distance, and you're looking for the k that does this the best. So silhouette score analysis is essentially can be done with this plot of silhouette coefficients. And these just provide a measure of the distance between a point and its neighboring cluster, so the other clusters that it does not belong to at different values of k. And so we want to find values of k where we have a maximized silhouette score. So the distance between points within a cluster and all of the other clusters around them are very large distances. So coefficients are usually in the range of -1 to 1. And so if you have a coefficient around -1, that means that your point is probably actually in the wrong cluster. It's actually closer to the other clusters than it is to its own cluster. If you have a coefficient of 0, a point is probably on the boundary between clusters. And then the closer you get to 1, the farther your point is from all the neighboring clusters. So we do want the best silhouette score. And here in this plot, you can see that for our data, it's pretty close between 2 clusters and 3 clusters, but ultimately 3 clusters has a little bit higher silhouette score. And so that's kind of what we're going with for our K. So to actually compute k-means clustering, you initialize your initial random cluster centers. So often this will just be the same number of clusters that you eventually want. And often you'll pick centers that are existing data points randomly. And then you start assigning all of the other objects in your data set to the closest center. And then you'll actually recompute the cluster centers to be the mean value of all of those cluster members that you just assigned. So this will result in kind of a shifting of this cluster center. And then you'll kind of reiterate, or you'll kind of first calculate the total squared Euclidean distance between those cluster members. And then you can actually reiterate through that process of reassigning data objects to new clusters as needed, based on whichever one is the closest. And so if you reach a certain number of iterations, your clustering may end, or if basically you reach convergence, so the cluster centers are no longer changing with each iteration, then you can also end the clustering there. And then that's how you kind of know which clusters you have. So k-means clustering, like I said earlier, it's pretty commonly used because it's quite some like the implementations for it are quite simple, and it is quite intuitive to understand. But one limitation is that the size, shape, and the density of the clusters can all greatly affect the success of k-means clustering. So k-means clustering does tend to favor equal-sized, equal-density, well-spaced spherical clusters. If you think about looking for trying to assign points to a center you're going to kind of be looking for these more elliptical or circular shaped clusters, which might not necessarily be true to your data. So real life data is not necessarily that neat. And also, even when you do have a certain number of K, for instance, here we have these 3 clusters on the left that we got with K-means clustering. We don't actually know if maybe the true clusters look more like the image on the right. But K-means clustering is kind of looking for more equal size clusters. So if the clusters are all very different sizes or they're very differently spread out, then it has a hard time actually detecting those patterns. Another example, if you think about data sets that are in odd shapes that aren't very spherical or circular, like in database 2 or database 3, K-means clustering is going to give you a clustering pattern that probably does not actually reflect the patterns that you can even see by eye from this data set. So in that case, you also would probably not want to use K-means clustering.